Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast. This is episode 5 of the Blackout series and part 3 of Revisionism and the Historical Blackout. So we left off page 40. Bemis concluded this review with what is possibly the most incredible example of foot swallowing in the whole history of book reviewing. One thing ought to be evident to all of us by our victory over Germany and Japan. No matter what our folly in losing the peace, we have at least survived to confront the second, even greater menace of another totalitarian power. We might not stand vis-a-vis with the Soviets today if President Roosevelt had not entertained a conviction that action against the Axis was necessary. In other words, all the physical, financial, and moral losses of the United States in the Second World War were justified and well expended in order that we might face another world war against a far stronger enemy. With these comments, we may leave Bemis to the logicians. The New York Herald Tribune book review handled the Chamberlain book much as it did the Times. It placed the review on the 12th page, following reviews of many relatively trivial volumes. It did not seek out a professional critic, but assigned one of its own hatchet men, August Heckscher, to write the review. While the book was smeared as a revival of pre-war isolationism, Heckscher was not able to succeed any better than Bemis in disposing of the Chamberlain's material and arguments. He had to rest satisfied with espousing the perpetual war for perpetual peace program for our current internationalists. If the First and Second Crusades have failed to provide peace, security, and prosperity, we can keep on trying. Other and more bloody crusades may turn the trick, even though Arnold J. Toynbee had admitted that any further crusades may leave only the pygmies, or perhaps only the ants or apes to wrestle with the aftermath. Perhaps the most remarkable example of smearing the Chamberlain book was the review which was published in The New Leader, written by our old friend Harry D. Gideonsey. The New Leader is a sprightly journal controlled mainly by socialists and ex-socialists who deserted Norman Thomas in his brave and stand against our entry into the Second World War, and by totalitarian liberals. Both groups were fanatically in favor of our intervention in the Second World War and are now in the vanguard of those who wish to enter a third crusade to the interest of perpetual war for perpetual peace and the suppression of red sin throughout the world. Chamberlain writes for this periodical, though his presence seems somewhat incongruous in such an editorial group. But the fact that Chamberlain is a regular contributor to the New Leader weighed less heavily with the editor than his offense in debunking our First and Second Crusades and his warning against our entering the third. Therefore, it was decided that Chamberlain's book must be smeared, and a man who was chosen to do it who could be relied upon. There is no doubt about Gideonsey's dependability for the task, both from his well-known general attitude towards interventionism, from his earlier elaborate smoothing of beard in The New Leader. Gideonsey did not let the editor down, except that he was only able to bring to bear against Chamberlain the same threadbare smears that he had used against Beard. He led off with a blanket condemnation. This is a bitter and unconvincing book. The worthlessness of much of Chamberlain's book, according to Gideonsey, required nothing more in the way of proof than to show that he agreed with Colonel McCormick in the Chicago Tribune. At least half of the contingents of Mr. Chamberlain's book is another rehash of the Chicago Tribune history of World War II. Gideonsey repeated the old alarmist dud to the effect that if we had not gone to war against Hitler, he would have made a vassal of Stalin and Soviet Russia and would have controlled the old world from the English Channel to Vladivostok. In the December 18, 1950 issue of The New Leader, Chamberlain submitted a crushing answer to Gideonsey and the other smearing reviewers. The New York Post called Chamberlain a totalitarian conservative and painted him as a special favorite of the McCormick-Patterson axis. The overwhelming majority of the reviews of the book did not rise above the level of smearing, the lowest point of which was reached in the review by James M. Menifee in the Saturday Review of Literature. That the progress of disillusionment with respect to the results of the Second Crusade and the shock of the Korean War may have made a few editors a trifle more tolerant of reality in world affairs was possibly demonstrated by the fact that Chamberlain's book was warmly praised in the review in the Wall Street Journal and was accorded a fair treatment in the internationalist Chicago Daily News. Frederick R. Sanborn's concise, elaborately documented, and closely reasoned volume designed for war, devoted chiefly to an account of President Roosevelt's secret war program after 1937, was treated much like the Morgenstern and Chamberlain books. Though it was more extensively ignored in the press, when not ignored, it was smeared in most of the reviews. The New York Times thought it had been taken care of the matter by handing the book over to Samuel Flagg Bemis for reviewing. By this time, however, Bemis had reached the last edition of My Struggle Against the Historical Blackout, with its account of his foot-swallowing feat in his Times review of Chamberlain's volume. So Bemis, while rejecting Sanborn's version of American diplomacy from 1937 to Pearl Harbor, was relatively cautious and respectful. Months after the book appeared, the Herald Tribune finally and reluctantly reviewed it, after much prodding by Sanborn. It handed it over to another warhorse among the hatchet men, Gordon A. Craig of Princeton. He indulged mainly in the shadowboxing for which Walter Millis had shown such talent. The review, while of the same smearing variety, was evasive, as had been Craig's review of Morgenstern's book in the Times years before. He refused to control the facts and even went so far in historical humor as to accept Cordell Hall's statement at their face value. The Sanborn book was smeared in most of the Scripps Howard papers that reviewed it at all, via the Rocky Mountain News, February 18, 1951, though this chain has been in the vanguard of pre-war isolationism. A characteristic newspaper slur was out of the Chattanooga Times, which proclaimed that Sanborn's book was as impartial as the Chicago Tribune or Westbrook Pegler. Felix Whittemer reviewed the book in the New Leader, March 26, 1951. The editors had apparently become bored themselves with the monotonous uniformity of the unvaried dead cats thrown at revisionist books by Harry Gideonsi. The Whittemer review was a masterpiece of doublethink. He smeared the book as a sad spectacle and a biased and myopic account of diplomacy in the guise of objectivity. He asked Sanborn of amazing ignorance of modern Japanese policies, yet a little later on he expressed himself as in almost complete agreement with Sanborn's account of the crucial Japanese-American negotiations in 1941. It is perfectly true, as Dr. Sanborn proves, that in 1941 the Japanese seriously wanted peace and that Roosevelt and Hull used every possible device to forestall it. It had to provoke an open attack by Japan. He even admits that Roosevelt and Hull anticipated this attack. He excuses all of this on the grounds that our entry into the war was obligatory for American security from Nazi invasion and for the salvation of humanity, and that the provocation of the Japanese was only a penetrating foresight, because Hitler and Mussolini were just mean enough to rise to Roosevelt's war bait in the Atlantic. Hence, we had to incite Japan to attack us in order to get into the war through the Pacific back door. Even the new leader felt impelled to publish a rejoinder by Sanborn. We have already pointed out that virtually all the important periodicals, Time, Newsweek, The New Yorker, the Saturday Review of Literature, The Nation, The New Republic, Harper's, and The Atlantic Monthly, had wisely decided that they could protect the Roosevelt and internationalist legend better by ignoring the book entirely than by smearing it in reviews. The American Historical Review did not even mention the volume in a book note. The reviewing of the book by Charles Cahill Callan Tansel, Backdoor to War, ran true to the form established with reference to revisionist volumes. The Tansel tome is more outspoken and more heavily documented than any other revisionist treatise. So while it more violently enraged interventionist reviewers, it intimidated and restrained them in some cases. At least they were more restrained than they would have been if the book were not so formidable an exhibit of arduous and exhaustive scholarship. Dexter Perkins reviewed the book about as gingerly and cautiously in the New York Times Book Review, May 11, 1952, as earlier Bemis had handled the Sanborn volume. He was apparently also somewhat concerned about a possible comment on his review in future editions of My Historical Blackout. Aside from reiterating his well-known theme to the effect that President Roosevelt was reluctantly pushed into war by the force of an ardent and alarming public opinion, Perkins mainly contented himself with berating the animus and bitterness shown by Mr. Tansel. This bitterness appeared to consist actually in producing documentary proof that the Roosevelt-Hull conspiracy constituted one of the major public crimes of human history. The review by Basil Roch in the Herald Tribune Book Review, June 1st, 1952, was as brash and reckless as was Roch's own book, Roosevelt from Munich to Pearl Harbor. It was not unfairly referred to by one reader as a masterpiece of misrepresentation. As the Byzantine Emperor Basil II earned the title Basil the Bulgar Slayer, so Roch can thoroughly be awarded the title of Basil the Creator. As I have shown in my brochure, Roche on Roosevelt, Professor Roche in his book created for Roosevelt a foreign policy which bore very slight resemblance to the one which the president actually followed. So in his review of the Tansel volume, he created a book which had little relationship to the one he was supposed to be reviewing. The book and the review must be read to allow one to become fully aware of the extent to which this is true. Rauch accused Tansel of making statements and drawing conclusions which had no documentary support whatever, though in the book itself hundreds of footnotes and references to acres of documents were presented to buttress Tansel's statements. Backdoor to War was tardily and loftily smeared in the Saturday Review of Literature on August 2nd, 1952, by Professor Lindsay Rogers of Columbia University. Professor Rogers is not a court historian, but he was the leading court political scientist and court jester in the original New Deal Brain Trust. He pays tribute to the enormous industry of 5 years with the ponderous tome required. But he tells the reader that it has been largely wasted because Professor Tansel has outdone the late Dr. Beard at espousing the devil theory of history and has interlarded this book with distressing diatribes. The devil theory of history appears to reside in the fact that Professor Tansel adopts a critical attitude towards the Roosevelt foreign policy and that he assigns considerable professional responsibility for President Roosevelt for the course of our foreign affairs after 1933. The diatribes are occasional penetrating comments on Roosevelt and his foreign policy, which, had they been directed against the critics of Mr. Roosevelt, would have been praised by Professor Rogers as distilled wisdom and brilliant bon mots. The Tansel book was belatedly reviewed at length in The Nation, October 4th, 1952, by Professor Charles G. Griffin, who had reviewed the Beard volume in the American Historical Review. It is evident from the opening sentences of the review that Professor Griffin regarded any comprehensive marshaling of the facts relative to Roosevelt foreign policy as a violent attack. The gist of the review was much the same as that by Professor Rogers in the Saturday Review of Literature. Both reviewers are compelled to recognize the vast amount of research which went into the preparation of the Tansel book. But Professor Griffin, like Professor Rogers, holds that all this vitiated by Tansel's cogent and penetrating characterizations. All right. Which are variously described as opprobrious and objectionable terminology, invective, innuendo, insinuation, and the like. Doubtless, Professor Griffin, like Professor Rogers, would have regarded this material as brilliant and praiseworthy verbiage if it had been written in praise of the Roosevelt policy. But at last, Professor Griffin's presentation of his views on the Tansel volume constituted a formal and ostensible review, not a brief and casual smear. And he does concede at the end of the review that the Tansel volume has value and that it corrects the fantastic mythology which prevailed during the Second World War. The review by Arthur Kemp and the Freedmen, May 9, 1952, was friendly and commendatory. Professor Tansel's book was harshly reviewed in the American Historical Review, October 1952, by Dean Julius W. Pratt. That the letter had lined up with our Ministry of Truth could have been ascertained in advance of the review by comparing his early trenchant anti-imperialist writings in his books and in his articles in the American Mercury with his recent America's Colonial Experiment. The flavor of his review could readily be anticipated. However, Dean Pratt did concede that the book was the most weighty documented of the revisionist works of the Second World War, and that Professor Tansel has produced a book of great learning. One statement in the review calls for corrective comment. The fact that a scholar with Professor Tansel's well-known views on American foreign policy was allowed the free run of confidential State Department files should lay at rest the theory that there existed a favored group of court historians who speak only kind words of the Roosevelt diplomacy. While Tansel did examine more documents than any other revisionist historian, he had nothing like the free access to archives and diaries which was accorded to men like Professor Langer and Gleason and Dr. Herbert Weiss. Dr. Beard's attack on the State Department favoritism eased his entry, and some of his former graduate students were in charge of important sections of the documents. Even so, he was barred from many, his notes subjected to scrutiny, and some of them confiscated. One of the most extreme smears of the book was written by professional historian Professor Richard W. Van Alstyne of the University of Southern California and published in the Pacific Book Review in November 1952. Van Alstyne concluded that Backdoor to War is a striking monument to pedantic scholarship, but it is built on a tiny mound of historical understanding. He did, however, make out one sound point that the book has a misleading title, and that it is more a study of the origins of the Second World War than specifically of Roosevelt foreign policy. The New Republic did not review the book, but the editor, Michael Straight, subjected it to the lowest and most amazing smear that any revisionist book has yet received. In the issue of June 16, 1952, Straight delivered himself of the following material suitable for presentation by the late Mr. Ripley. This book is part of a devious attack on American diplomacy directed by Dr. Edmund Walsh, S.J. from Georgetown University. Tansel argues that the United States, not Germany or Japan, was the aggressor in the Second World War. These are the superstitions that occupied Beard and his senility and focused John T. Flynn's mania for hatred. It would be easily dismissed were it not such useful material for demagogues in the 1952 campaign. Nothing better illustrates the shift in attitude on the part of the New Republic since the 1920s, when it took the lead in promoting revisionism under Herbert Crowley and Robert Littell, even though Mr. Straight's mother was also financing the journal at the time. Very interesting and relevant as bearing on Mr. Straight's charge that Professor Tansel's book was the product of a Catholic plot to smear Roosevelt foreign policy is the fact that the Catholic periodical, America, reflecting the international interventionist wing of American Catholic opinion, published a rather bitter attack by Father William A. Lucy upon the Tansel volume in its issue on June 14, 1952. A very amusing and instructive example of the length to which interventionists will go in the quest of smears of revisionist books is proof provided in the case of the Christian Register. The periodical is edited by Melvin Arnold, a liberal Unitarian and the head of the Beacon Press, which has published books by Paul Blanchard that have so vigorously attacked Catholic political power. Yet being an ardent interventionist and adulator of Roosevelt foreign policy, Mr. Arnold reached out eagerly for the hostile review of the Tansel book by Father Lucy in one of the leading political organs of Jesuit Catholic journalism and reprinted it in the December 1952 issue of his own magazine. Professor Tansel's book was reviewed in the Mississippi Valley Historical Review, December 1952, by Professor Reuel Bartlett. Professor Bartlett had been on the program of the American Historical Association in Chicago in December 1950 to criticize the paper presented at the time by Professor Tansel on the background of American entry into the Second World War. He was somewhat roughly handled by Professor Tansel in the discussion that followed. All this was well known to the editor of the Mississippi Valley Historical Review. Nevertheless, he chose Professor Bartlett to review Professor Tansel's book, and the result was just what could have been expected. The flavor of the review is shown by the closing lines. This book is unredeemed by humor, art, or insight. To read it and to write it are unrewarding tasks. Thus far, the Journal of Modern History has not reviewed the book, and the criticisms of the Tansel volume by such professional historians as Professors Harrington, Pratt, and Van Alstyne, there is one slightly humorous item, namely the charge that Tansel does not support all of his contentions by citations from confidential archival material. As a matter of fact, the only honest and fair criticism of Tansel's procedure is that, like so many professional diplomatic historians, he relies too much on archival and allied materials when other resources of information are often far more illuminating and reliable. Nevertheless, his professional critics contend that he never proves an assertion unless he brings archival material to his support, even though he may cite sources of more important types and sources of evidence. One might be led to suppose that Tansel could not prove the guilt of President Roosevelt relative to Pearl Harbor unless he could produce from the archives a confession signed in the handwriting of the late president. From what has been sent forth above, it is evident that not one professional historical journal has provided readers with a fair and objective appraisal of Professor Tansel's monumental volume Backdoor to War. The majority of newspaper reviews smeared the book, though it was warmly praised not only by the Chicago Tribune, but by some other papers like the Indianapolis Star. In the newspaper reviews, the dominant note was Tansel's alleged bias and bitterness, in other words, his devotion to candor and integrity. Interestingly enough, the editor of the Cleveland Plain Dealer was apparently so displeased by the unfair reviews that he wrote an editorial, June 8, 1952, praising the Tansel volume and commending revisionism in general. Probably the most extreme job of smearing ever turned in on a liberal who attacked the foreign policy of Roosevelt was done on John T. Flynn, whose revisionist writings were limited to the 2 brochures of Pearl Harbor and to a few pages in his book. The Roosevelt myth. Flynn had long been a special favorite of the liberal journals. He was probably the leading specialist for the New Republic in exposing the evils of finance capitalism. His security speculation was a masterpiece in the field. His graft in business was perhaps the ablest indictment of the business ideals and methods of the Harding Coolidge era. He was one of the staff who aided Pecora in the investigation of the sins of Wall Street. He was also an assistant to Senator General Gerald P. Nye in the famous munitions and armaments investigation. He was at one time a member of the Board of Higher Education in New York City and a lecturer at the New York for Social Research. Few men rated higher in the esteem of Eastern liberals. But when Flynn became a leading member of the American First Movement and began to oppose President Roosevelt's war policy, his erstwhile liberal admirers who had taken to warmongering turned on him savagely. Their animus increased when Flynn revealed the fascist trends in our war policy in his book, As We Go Marching, and when he told the truth about Pearl Harbor in 2 trenchant brochures. Since that time, he has been the victim of incessant smearing by the totalitarian liberals and the interventionist crowd. They have done their best to drive him into penury and obscurity. Only his fighting Irish spirit has enabled him to survive. Even the progressive, despite its anti-war policy, joined in the smearing. A good sample of the irresponsibility in smearing Flynn is the statement of Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. in the New York Post, to the effect that the Yalta Conference will redound to the honor of Franklin Delano Roosevelt unless a fascist revolution installs William Henry Chamberlain and John T. Flynn as official national historians. It so happens that Flynn has, for more than a decade now, been recognized as one of the most stalwart libertarians and individualists, and has even been smeared for being such by persons in Schlesinger's intellectual circle. One of the reasons why their frenzied hatredism of him is his revelation of fascist trends in Roosevelt foreign policy and its political results. Chamberlain is also conspicuous for his libertarian trends and his protests against military state capitalism. The Blackout contingent was even more successful in that their attacks on Upton Close, as a result of his candid radio broadcasts on our foreign policy, he was driven off the air for the lecture platform and out of the press, and his books on the Far East were virtually barred from circulation. Though I have personally written nothing on revisionism relating to the Second World War beyond several brief brochures seeking to expose some of the more characteristic methods of the Blackout contingent, the smear bun has gone to work on me far more vigorously than was the case following all my revisionist articles and books combined after the First World War. The silent treatment has been comprehensively applied to anything I have published recently in whatever field. When my History of Western Civilization appeared in 1935, it was very glowingly reviewed on the front page of the New York Times Book Review, and of the Herald Tribune Books, and of the Saturday Review of Literature. The American Historical Review gave it a long and favorable review by the foremost American authority in the field. When my Society in Transition was published in 1939, the Times accorded it the unique honor of reviewing a college textbook on the first page of its book review. But when my Survey of Western Civilization and Introduction to the History of Sociology were published in 1947, and my Historical Sociology in 1948, none of the above-mentioned publications, so far as could be discovered, gave any of them so much as a book note. Apparently, the movement has gone so far that authors have been suppressed or given the silent treatment for fear that they might later on publish some little truth on world affairs. The author of this chapter was naturally suspect because of his writings on the First World War. The sub rosa activities of the Blackout smearbund have gone much further. I have been smeared as both an extreme radical and an extreme reactionary, and as everything undesirable between the two extremes. One historian smeared me as a naive isolationist, though actually I was working for sane internationalism at the time of his birth. The smearbund has not only condemned my books to the silent treatment, barred me from all leading periodicals, and sought to dissuade publishers from accepting my books on any subject, but its members have also carried on extensive subterranean intrigue seeking to discourage the use of my textbooks in the fields of the history of civilization and sociology, where the content of my tomes does not touch even remotely on the issues of revisionism. Going beyond my writings, the Blackout Gestapo forced the most powerful lecture manager in the United States to drop me from his list of lecturers. The Blackout Boys have not rested content with smearing those who have sought to tell the truth about the causes of the Second World War. They have now advanced to the point where they are seeking to smear those who told the truth about the causes of the First World War. At the meeting of the American Historical Association in Boston in December 1949, two papers were read by Richard W. Leopold and Selig Adler that endeavored to undermine the established revisionist writings regarding the prelude to the conflict. Adler implied that revisionism after 1918 was in its origins a sort of Bolshevik plot, and that the revisionist writers were consciously or unconsciously dupes of the Bolsheviks and unrepentant Germans. Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr., in an article in the Partisan Review, has even gone so far as to attack those who have written in the revisionist tone on the causes of the Civil War. The next step will be to attack the revisionism of historical opinion relative to the causes of the American historical revolution and to find that, after all, Big Bill Thompson was right in his views of that conflict and in his threat to throw George V into the Chicago Ship Canal. In other words, revisionism, which only means bringing history into accord with the facts, now seems to be rejected by the Blackout Boys as a mortal sin against Cleo, the muse of their subject. This attack on revisionism, even with respect to the First World War, is now creeping into the routine college textbooks. It provides the leitmotif of Harrison's above-mentioned book, The Age of Global Strife. Not only are books concerned primarily with an honest account of the diplomacy connected with the coming of the Second World War ignored and smeared, his similar treatment is accorded to books which even indirectly reflect on the official mythology in this area. For example, a Frank Riel's splendid and courageous book on the case of General Yamashita was rather generally attacked, and outrageously so, by John H. E. Freed in the Political Science Quarterly. September 1950, W.T. Coach, who had done splendid work as the head of the University of Chicago Press, was relieved of his post, in part because of his criticism of the publication of this book. The best book on Japan, which had been published since Pearl Harbor, Mirror for Americans, Japan, by Helen Mears, was allowed to die quietly by its publishers after the blackout contingent began to exert pressure against it. While the smear bund has usually rested content with an effort to defame and impoverish those whom it smears, it went even further in the case of Lawrence Dennis and sought to jail him on the charges of sedition. Dennis, a brilliant Harvard graduate, had served in important posts in American diplomatic service for 8 years. He had been one of the first to enlist in the Plattsburgh training experiment before the First World War, 1915, and has served with distinction as an officer in the war. After retiring from the diplomatic service, he was employed by leading banking and brokerage firms as an expert on foreign bonds. Like John T. Flynn, he was then a favorite of left-wing American liberals, and it exposed the foreign bond frauds in the New Republic at about the same time that Flynn was doing a comparable piece of work in the investment trusts. He incurred the wrath of the liberals by bringing out a book in 1936 entitled The Coming American Fascism. He predicted that the New Deal would wind up in a system of fascism, whatever the name given to it, and described what the system would probably be like. The interventionists who were enraged by his weekly foreign letter, which opposed our entry into the Second World War, and by his Dynamics of War and Revolution, the best book written in the United States on the institutional forces pushing us into war and on probable results of such war, the pro-war forces induced Harper's and Brothers to withdraw the book almost immediately after its publication. Though Dennis is actually an aggressive individualist, he was accused of being an ardent fascist and was railroaded in the mass sedition trial to Washington in 1944. That the trial ended in a farce was due mainly to the fact that Dennis personally outlined and conducted the defense. But though surely one of the most talented writers and lecturers in the United States today, he's been driven into complete obscurity. Not even Regnery or Devin Adair dares to bring out a book under his name. Okay. Part 4. Global crusading and the historical blackout are undermining historical integrity. The revisionist position bearing on the Second World War is more firmly established factually, even on the basis of the materials which revisionist scholars are permitted to examine, than the revisionism of the 1920s was by the revelations produced after 1918. But the effective presentation of revisionist contentions is frustrated so far as any substantial influence is concerned over any predictable future. Certain revisionist scholars, led by the late Charles Austin Beard, have justly protested the fact that they are not permitted anything like the same access to the relevant documents as is the case with the so-called court historians. This is true and deplorable, but it is not a consideration of major importance with respect to revisionism today. Revisionists already have plenty of facts. It may be safely assumed that any further revelations will only more firmly establish the revisionist position. Otherwise, all the archives and other still secret materials would, long since, have been available to reputable scholars, so that President Roosevelt and his administration might be cleared of unfair and inaccurate charges founded upon limited and unreliable information. If there were nothing to hide, then there would obviously be no reason for denying access to the documents. In short, the revisionist position is not likely to be shattered by any future documentary revelations. There is every prospect that it will be notably strengthened thereby, and this assumption is confirmed by some recently edited documents on the Far Eastern situation in 1937. These show that China and Japan were growing tired of friction and conflict and were about to agree that they should get together and oppose the communists as the chief common enemy, but the American authorities looked askance at this. Indeed, they encouraged and made possible the resumption of war between China and Japan. The development of revisionism in connection with the Second World War is placed in jeopardy mainly by the hostile attitude which exists on the part of both the general public and the historical profession towards accepting the facts and their implications with respect to world events and American policies during the last 15 years. The attitude and emotions of the public during wartime have been maintained without notable change by means of persistent propaganda. There have been no such disillusionment and reversal of attitude since 1945, as took place rather rapidly after 1918. The United States seems all too likely to undertake a third bloody crusade before it is fully aware of the real causes and disastrous results of the second. Factual justification for a reversal of public attitudes and emotions is far more extensive and impressive than was the case following the First World War. But the party which was in power during the war continued to hold office until 1953. And the potency and scope of propaganda has so increased that the emotions and convictions of wartime have been perpetuated for more than a decade after Pearl Harbor. Incidentally, this is ominous evidence of our susceptibility to propaganda as we approach the 1984 way of life. The historical profession is perhaps even less tolerant of revisionism than is the general public. Most of those who have been leading revisionists during the 1920s espoused our Second Crusade even before it exploded into war at the time of Pearl Harbor. Great numbers of historians entered into war propaganda work of one kind or another after Pearl Harbor, and have a vested interest in perpetuating the myth of the nobility of the cause which enlisted their services. Therefore, the historical profession is oriented and powerfully fortified against any acceptance of revisionist scholarship. A number of the leading revisionists of the 1920s have now become court historians, and most of the other erstwhile revisionists refuse to admit that we were as thoroughly misled by the Second Crusade as by the First. As a result of this, and numerous other factors and forces hostile to revisionism, the situation is not encouraging to any historians who might otherwise be inclined to undertake honest research in the field. To do so would mean department antagonism, loss of promotion, and possibly discharge from their posts. Those not dissuaded by such considerations have to face irresponsible smearing. The very idea or concept of revisionism is now anathema and is actually under fire at the hands of a number of prominent historians. In case a few historians are not discouraged and intimidated by professional hostility or the prospects of irresponsible smearing and remain determined to do substantial work on the actual causes and merits of the Second World War, there is every likelihood that their efforts will prove futile, so far as publication is concerned. Forthright revisionist material, however scholarly, is for all practical purposes excluded from publications in the great majority of our newspapers and periodicals. Only two small publishing houses in the United States have been willing to publish books embodying revisionist facts and conclusions, and they have often required subsidies beyond the resources of the average private scholar. Few historians are going to be lured by the prospect of devoting years of research to a project and then be compelled to store away their completed manuscripts in a filing cabinet. They are more likely to be practical and fall in line with the court historians, which is the path to professional prestige and prosperity today. When any scholar defies professional hostility and successfully gambles upon the slight prospect of publication for the results of his labors, there is little likelihood that the book will have anything like the same influence on the modification of public opinion as did the outstanding revisionist volumes of the 1920s and early 1930s. The probability is that any substantial meritorious revisionist volume will be given the silent treatment, that is, will not be reviewed at all in the majority of newspapers and periodicals. When a newspaper or periodical decides actually to review a revisionist book, it has available, as we have noted, large crops of hatchet men, both on its staff and drawn from eager academicians who can be relied upon to attack and smear revisionist volumes and to eulogize the works of court historians who seek to perpetuate the traditional mythology. There is thus very little probability that even the most substantial and voluminous revisionist writing on the Second World War can have any decisive impact upon public opinion for years to come. One only needs to contrast the enthusiastic reception accorded to Walter Millis's The Road to War in 1935 with the general ignoring or smearing of much more substantial and meritorious volume by William Henry Chamberlain, American Second Crusade, in 1950. The probability is that revisionism in relation to the Second World War will never be widely accepted directly on the basis of its factual merit. It will only become palatable, if ever, after we have suffered some devastating economic or political disaster, which causes the American public to reverse its attitudes and policies on world affairs, and to seek an ideological justification through espousing revisionist contentions. But it is obvious that it will probably require a tremendous shock, a veritable military and political catastrophe to bring about the degree of disillusionment and realism required to produce any such result. There is infinitely greater cause for a reversal of public attitudes today than there was in 1932, when Woodrow Wilson remarked to James Kearney, "I should like to see Germany clean up France," or 1923. And then I should like to see Josserand, the French ambassador, and tell him so to his face. But as he indicated above, this ample factual basis for a comparable revision of public opinion has produced no substantial public or historical disillusionment with respect to our Second Crusade. Disillusionment has not even gone far enough to produce tolerance toward those who seek to explain realistically the historical basis of the transformation of Stalin from the noble ally of a decade ago into the current incarnation of Satan himself. Okay, let's see. As is implied above, even though the tenets of revisionism with respect to the Second World War may at some distant time achieve popular acceptance in the wake of overwhelming national disaster, this will not necessarily mean any reinstatement of objective historical scholarship. The probability is that any such future period may also be one in which we will have completed the transition into 1984 society, which will crush out all semblance of historical freedom and objectivity. As we shall point out in a moment, ominous trends in this direction have already set in. What we may concede from all this is that both the public and the historians seem quite likely to be effectively protected against any immediate ravages at the hands of revisionism. But what they will pay for this protection may be the greatest disaster which historical science has ever encountered since the era of the cave paintings of the Stone Age. However much we may recoil from the prospect, there seems a strong probability that we are now entering the twilight of historical science. This is the penalty which has been exacted so far as history and historians are concerned for ballyhooing and defending crusades rather than seeking the truth. History has been an intellectual crusade to both world wars, and there is much doubt that it can be rehabilitated during the second half of the century. Indeed, there is every prospect that it will become more and more an instrument and adjunct of official propaganda, a supine instrument of the ministry of truth. Many will counter these assertions by contending that the elaborate development of the methodology of historical research and exposition in our day is an adequate safeguard against the eclipse of historical integrity, prestige, and independence. But technical methodology is of little significance if those who utilize it are dominated by intense emotions of personal ambition rather than by a desire to ascertain the facts. Ample footnotes are no guarantee of accuracy or objectivity. Today, they may only document falsehood. Formal compliance with technical methodology may only enable an historian to distort or falsify material in more complicated and ostensibly impressive fashion. If one does not wish to ascertain or state the facts, then the most effective methods of locating, classifying, and expounding the facts are nullified and of no avail. Only a generation or so ago, it was believed by the most thoughtful historians that nationalism and militarism were the chief obstacle and menace to historical objectivity. It was assumed that an international outlook would make for truth and tolerance. It was held that if we understood the extensive and complicated international contributions to all national cultures, most forms of hatred and bias would disappear. Internationalists then stressed the blessings of peace. The great majority of them were pacifists, admired peace, meant peace when they said peace, and repudiated all thought of military crusades for peace. Had internationalism retained the same traits that it had possessed even as late as the mid-1930s, these assumptions as to the beneficent impact of internationalism upon historical writing might have borne out in fact. But during the years since 1937, the older Pacific internationalism has been virtually extinguished, and internationalism has itself been conquered by militarism and aggressive globaloney. Militarism was formerly closely linked to national arrogance. Today, it stalks behind the semantic disguise of internationalism, which has been a cloak for national aggrandizement and imperialism. Programs of world domination by great powers that would have left Napoleon or even Hitler aghast are now presented with a straight face as international crusades for freedom, peace, sweetness, and light. Peace is to be promoted and ultimately realized through bigger and more frequent wars. The obvious slogan of the internationalists of our day, who dominate the historical profession as well as the political scene, is perpetual war for perpetual peace. This, it may be noted, is also the ideological core of the 1984 society. All right, I think we'll end it here on page 59. So we have comments. We have Record Deepness, Dr. Reverend, GF, hello. Let's see. Earl Pipe. My live chat ballers and my YouTube scholars. Hello. Let's see. Basil 3 creator was kicked out of De La Salle in 1986. Professor Griffith was kicked out of Public Enemy in 1993 too. Record Deepness. So Flynn joins Forstall and McCarthy on the list of Irishmen subject to the ire of court historians and journalists. Record Deepness. Rather than a Catholic plot against Roosevelt, it would be more accurate to say Roosevelt and these later hatchet men were rooting out the Catholic bloc. Let's see. Chuck hung in 666, hello. Let's see. We got more here. Chikakin 666, Forstall, auto-corrected, determined to make one look like an idiot for 20 years. All right, everybody. Thank you. Make sure to turn in next week for part 6 of Historical Blackout and part 4 of Revisionism and the Historical Blackout. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Flight podcast, signing off.